Okay, good afternoon. My name's Andrea Farry and I'm here with my colleague Tracy Bentley. We both work at the British Council School in Madrid, where my role is as teaching and learning leader for English, where I lead that subject area. And we're here to talk today about putting literature at the heart of secondary English teaching and still working on all the literacy objectives that we know are so important, teaching students for whom English isn't their first language, but putting literature at the centre of that. So Tracy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, very briefly, I'm Tracy Bentley and I've been teaching at the British Council School for about 20 years now, 20 years now. And I've been teaching in secondary school literature and language and English as a second language.
Okay, shall we move to the next slide, Tracy? So I'll just start by mentioning the audit of the integrated curriculum, which really is how I became involved in the bilingual programme. I was asked to do an audit of the curriculum last year, and you'll be able to see that document in more depth. But as a good starting point, I think some of the main recommendations that came out of this audit were as follows. So to maximise cross-curricular links, including functional English for learning and whole school literacy policy, that might include phrases that are really useful for students to know for the classroom, knowing how teachers across all subject areas are going to approach supporting students in their literacy. The next point, which is extracurricular activities that support English, which of course could be any number of different activities. More explicit planning of texts for teaching as distinct from personal reading. So I think this really came up because I noticed in the curriculum that there were lists of texts which were really good, but you know, sometimes a book is quite appropriate for personal reading. It doesn't necessarily need a teacher's guidance. Students can be reading independently, but sometimes a text is really particularly well designed for classroom teaching. Perhaps there are issues within it, perhaps there's complex language that really needs a teacher to guide the understanding of it. Explicit list of writing types to be taught and practiced, and promoting reading and updating reading lists. I think I always find that it's very valuable indeed to try and stay in touch with new publications, new trends in children's and young adult literature, even though I know how hard it is when we're all so busy as teachers. And of course, often promoting reading and getting students reading is really the key to their progress in a language. And of course, now the next step this year is that we've formed a working group of ourselves as well as teachers from different schools. And we're really working towards trying to put together some guidance towards how teachers can put a literature focus in their English teaching. Okay, Tracy? So I'll continue this order just as I finish the introduction. So what we're going to talk about in this webinar, we're going to outline the difference between EFL, English as a foreign language teaching, and literature-based teaching, and what's our rationale? Why do we believe that putting literature at the heart of English teaching is important? Share what kind of literacy objectives can and should be achieved through literature, and to show you some examples both of how we'd go about planning a scheme of work and the types of activities that students might do, and we've got some examples of students' work later in our presentation.
Okay, I'll take over for a moment now. I'll be referring to the first point, which is really the basic why. Why do we think that literature should be at the heart of EFL teaching? Well, we've highlighted a few of the reasons. The main reason, you can see that it's highlighted here, is that the enjoyment of literature and reading for pleasure, it has been considered to be the single factor most likely to affect progress in language acquisition. This is for a number of reasons, but I think one of the main reasons actually is that it is so engaging. So it's a more engaging experience than other approaches. It has a purpose and a point. Once you're engaged with the text and you're interested in the characters and the plot and themes, then it's very easy to move into discussions and interaction with students and naturally move to exploring different layers of meaning and making the students and yourself care, and it's a shared experience. Okay, the values and empathy are also linked, not just to values, which are incredibly important, but also to the engagement. So the values and empathy can be promoted through literature, certain values and empathy. For example, if you were to teach, as we're going to show a sample of later, of Mice and Men, obviously that's promoting values of tolerance and an understanding of people who are different to yourself. There are many overlap texts that you could use for this, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, if you want to, for an understanding of groups and how groups can be oppressed. Once you're engaged with a text and it's the same single text, then you have endless possibilities for reinforcing grammar, vocabulary, reading, writing, speaking and listening. And because all these exercises are focused around the same text, the same characters, the same idea of the plot, it makes it, again, much more engaging. And students tend to have the grammar and the vocabulary more anchored than they would in separate tasks. Literature is a fantastic source of a fantastic topic because it's so flexible and it really allows the inclusion of other texts, maybe a non-fiction text with a fiction novel, music, videos, audios. You've got a host of resources on the internet. And just at the top there, I put, because literature is a model of high quality English. Literature is a model of real English. And so I think that like that, students get exposure to real English. I'll move on and I'll try and be a little bit quick here. We've just got a small sample of the many activities. So here we're looking at the third point, which is how do you go about doing it? We've got things like reading journals that you can keep, looking at character, theme, plot, own reactions, etc., summarising and character studies, all of these reinforcing language skills that you can see. Text division, where students are not overwhelmed by a huge chapter, but they can focus on small text and then come together and give a summary or talk about what happens in the text and the ideas with other groups. Links to styles of writing, for example, you can give, and we'll see an example of this later, you can give a model of writing, for example, a letter in which you summarise what happens, what is going to happen in the next chapter. Therefore, the students all get a support and a scaffolding with the reading. Film, of course, you can use constantly, before, after, instead of, and extracting vocabulary and language use is obviously easy, and you can build around that, trying to get topics, develop topics. Speaking and listening, crucial. So you can talk for writing around an image or a topic. You can do hot seating and questioning. We always do hot seating where the students write their own questions and answers at the beginning about the characters. Tableau, even if you've got a drama studio, let's assume that COVID will finish. So you can use that to explore hierarchies or feelings, emotions, and then use it to talk afterwards about their ideas. Improvisation, performance, you can get them to improvise performance in modern day English and maybe even write it up as a base script. They can video themselves, they can do presentations, obviously, all of this reinforcing oral language and listening. Writing, again, it's a case of cutting it up, breaking it down. So you could cut up paragraphs and look at how they fit together and which key words are that make them fit together. Gap fills for vocabulary, drafting and accuracy. There's a focus now on giving students more than one opportunity to improve their work. Modelled writing by the teacher, that could be modelled writing maybe which is poor and the students suggest improvements. Shared writing with students in groups. And finally, with vocabulary, we have things like tiered vocabulary, which is something they're doing in the UK at the moment, which is separating vocabulary into, for example, key vocabulary, useful vocabulary, and specialist vocabulary. And you can also do it for ordinary vocabulary. There are different sources there. Vocabulary diaries, which children can keep and share with other students and share with their parents. Pitching higher, it's the interaction that the teacher has with the students. So the teacher should avoid limiting their vocabulary when they're talking to children or students. So for example, instead of saying, I've left the door open or leave the door open, you can say, leave the door ajar. And then you're naturally exposing the children to a higher level of vocabulary. The feelings wheel, you can see a small picture of it in the corner, and it's just a tiered way of looking at vocabulary around theme, moving from the most obvious words to more specific and complex words. And then ordering words maybe from extreme to non-extreme, light to dark, happy to sad, and all of these are just a few examples of what you can do. All right, resources for teaching. You might want to stop the video and take a photograph or take a photograph now. We've just put up a few resources for teaching. You can see there are many resources nowadays on the internet for teaching, especially if you speak English, and you can access all the UK ones, the American ones, the Australian ones. We've highlighted teachit.co.uk, TES, the theatres, National Theatre, RSC, they produce their own packs. Sparks Notes, Cliff Notes, Classic Notes, all of these have got, for example, Sparks Notes has got a modern version, paraphrasing of the original Shakespeare. YouTube, you've got interviews, documentaries, teaching videos, audibles, podcasts, listening to the radio. Specific to Advice and Men, I found Just a Couple, Tutor Hunt, Penguin Random, and general advice. Or I often write PPT after the topic, and it's amazing how many PowerPoints people have already done, which you can easily give credit for, but edit. There are many audible versions of text, and Google's great for looking for old newspaper reports. Okay, so I'm going to pass you on to Andrea again now for objectives and planning.
Okay, so like Tracy said, we're just going to go through some ideas for how you might go about planning a scheme of work and making sure you're covering the objectives you want to. So what we've got here is just a quite basic sort of formula for how you might ensure that things you want your students to be able to do to ensure that they're covered across the school year. So you might list some of the key skills you want your students to be confident in, and then kind of plan out, okay, which term are we going to cover this in, which term are we going to cover these skills in. Some skills that are so key and constantly need reinforcing that they might need revisiting in subsequent terms. So this is just really an idea to ensure that you're kind of planning long term and thinking about what you want your students to achieve. Tracy, could we pass to the next slide?
Thank you.
Okay, and then what we've been looking at is actually taking objectives and breaking them down much further into kind of sub areas of teaching and outcomes for students, so that it's absolutely clear like what teachers actually need to teach in order for their students to reach those objectives. So what we've done here is we've taken year 9 for us, or segundo de ESO, as an example, and taken some of the objectives for that year group. So, for example, you can see that generally speaking, we divide our objectives into 4 key areas: writing, SPAG, which stands for spelling, punctuation and grammar. Obviously that works in conjunction with writing, but we do separate it into another area as it so often needs to be taught very explicitly. Then reading and speaking and listening. But as you can see, an objective might need teaching in lots of different areas. To take as an example, the blue column under SPAG, you've got an objective there is sentences and punctuation. But then what we've done there is just broken that down with, okay, well, what will we need to teach to ensure that our students are confident in their sentences and punctuation? We've gone there for, okay, sentence starters and language for different types of writing, making sure they know how to construct simple, compound and simple sentences. You know, giving them kind of tips for constructing complex sentences, such as avoiding starting with I or the or other pronouns. Looking at subordinate clauses and relative clauses, are students confident in how to incorporate those into their sentences? Sentence length and different styles of sentences for effect. How to avoid comma splicing, always a common error, and accuracy with basic punctuation. Use of more sophisticated punctuation, such as colons and semicolons, or placing punctuation for effect, not just to demarcate sentences. I'm not going to read through the breakdowns of the other objectives, but the point here is that it's well worthwhile to take an objective and stop and think, okay, well, what does this mean in the classroom? What do we need to teach students? What do we need to practice with students? What do we need to reinforce with students and give them tools and tricks in order to succeed in achieving the objective of, for example, sentences and punctuation to the best that they can?
Shall I move to the next page?
Okay, so just to, I mean, obviously objectives clearly link then into assessment. And just to give you an idea of how we approach assessment in our school. So this is not our whole assessment criteria. You can see it's got lots of tiny writing as it is, so it's just a snippet of the document. But you can see along the top, we've got writing, then we've got SPAG. So again, we're using those key 4 areas, and then you can see each of those is subdivided into different objectives, such as under writing. We've got writing for form and purpose, ideas, creativity, organisation. That would be like paragraphing and such. And then down the left-hand side there, you can see that these grades are kind of graduated. So for us in the lower half of secondary, we have years 7, 8 and 9. Years 8 and 9 would equate to first and second of ESO. And you can see, for example, that what would be a grade 6 in year 7 would be a grade 5 in year 8, and then only a grade 4 in year 9. So the idea is that a student should be able to sustain that same level each year by making a usual amount of progress. In order to say a student's been working on a grade 6 and then in year 8 say they wanted to get a grade 7, they actually need to move up 2 whole levels in the kind of work they're producing. I also think it's very useful to have this very specific criteria so that you know, that you can ask yourself, okay, well, what exactly should a grade 5 look like? What should a grade 6 look like, etc. And I think what we've done here in creating our own assessment criteria is it's enabled us to really ask questions like, well, what do second language learners need, even those with a very high level of English? For example, you can see to the right-hand side, we've incorporated grammar, tense, clarity of expression. So this is where we might put in specific things that we'd want to teach students and be looking for them to use. For example, you know, do they use prepositions correctly? Do they sometimes have trouble with phrasing? Do they use conditionals correctly? So we've got this quite explicit, quite detailed assessment criteria, which helps us to assess students as accurately as we can, and for everyone to know what we're looking for to make sure it's consistent across teachers.
Okay, achieving literacy objectives through literature. Let's have a look. Okay, shall I take over this section, Andrea? Yeah, okay. All right then. Well, we've looked at why literature should be at the heart, if you remember the first slide, and we've looked at a few activities and we looked at objectives and assessments. So what we're doing here is we're going to try and show you a theoretical series of lessons, just 3 lessons of mice and men, just to give a clear example of how that would work. So if you're not sure of the story of mice and men, and there's a wonderful film that goes along with it, we've got a summary here. So George and Lenny are drifters and they follow the work. They arrive in California. Lenny is simple-minded. I'm not sure we could use that expression really, but anyway, Lenny's got learning difficulties and he's a good man, and George helps him and supports him. But when they get to Salinas Valley, Lenny, because he's so strong, is seen as a threat or a challenge, and he becomes a victim of his own strength. It's an incredibly beautiful story and quite tragic. Everybody would be certainly engaged in this novel. Okay, so when we're planning, of course, you don't do a totally detailed plan immediately, but you start. So the planning here is we're taking into account that this planning is aimed at the 2nd of SO. The number of lessons per week would be 3 or 4, with 1 standalone grammar or a SPAG lesson. And then we would reinforce the content of the SPAG lesson, in this case, via literature-related tasks. Now, you're going to see that in the examples of work that Andrea will be presenting. And you can see how we use main clauses and subordinate clauses. And also, in one of the pieces of work that she shows of character, you can also see how the children are using that language and those language structures. All right, so what we're going to be doing is we're looking at, at writing the opening of a short story. Steinbeck's opening would be the starting point, but we would be making changes to setting characters and the relationship between them. And we would aim to have the students come up with a title of the story based around conflict. Let's have a look at how we would do this. Okay, now this looks quite complex, and you know, you wouldn't be expected to do all of the planning all in one go. You'll develop it as you go. But it is fun doing this kind of planning because it means that you can be more creative as a teacher, and you can find out so much more and share that learning with the students. So in lesson 1 then, I've got vocabulary and feelings, speculation, video, and a discussion of the suffering of people in the Great Depression. So I separated the lesson into 4 parts, into a short starter, maybe about 10 minutes, an introduction, 15, 20 minutes, a main activity, 15 minutes, and short plenary, maybe 5 minutes. Okay, so that lesson is structured. It's just a basic scheme. So in the starter, the class looks at iconic images of the Great Depression. We've all seen those photos of people from the Great Depression. Students would suggest words for the emotions of these people. You could use posters maybe, but you would be identifying some language. You would give them the language that they can use to express their ideas. So in this case, I suggested that the students might use they might feel. So after all, they're year 9 and they're working on the speculative. Question, why am I showing you these photos? Students would engage in answer and you would introduce the title of the novel. Warn students, you're going to move on to a short video in the introduction on Steinbeck's biography and the Great Depression. You would warn students that there'll be a quiz later on to test further points, so you'd be encouraging them to take notes. And I've suggested a short video here which addresses the main themes and messages of the novels. You could either give students as well as note taking 10 questions, or you could do a true or false sheet to give them some more support. Then you can use that as a structure to do feedback in class. As you go, I would write the main themes up that the children are suggesting on the wall. The main activity would be the feelings wheel that you saw earlier. Focus on fear and sadness, start introducing words for fear and sadness, and try and link these in so that, again, the students in groups can then write, they might feel the Great Depression would make me feel because, and then the children can share their suggestions. Students begin with a reading journal. And they can, on the first page, they can write some notes on the historical context. So what you're doing is you're taking their notes or their ideas from the video, and then they're using writing to write it down and practice their writing. As a short plenary, I probably would have a laugh with them and maybe do Beat the Teacher, which is a fun exercise where students and teacher ask each other questions about, in this case, the historical context, and whoever wins something. So students could win learning awards maybe, or a minute off or something. I don't know what the teacher wins though. All right, if we go on to lesson 2, I'm going to do this in less depth. Now you've got the feeling for it. So you've got starter, introductory part, a main activity, and plenary again. The things I'm going to cover in lesson 2 are reading the novel, analysing, speculation, again, building on that, dry and humid landscape vocabulary now, understanding the text, how writers strategies to craft their writing, and students are going to implement, and it depends on your group for how much support you give them. Okay, so I would suggest that in the starter you show maps of Salinas Valley. What do you think the landscape will be like? So again, using that word might to predict this time and speculate. You would be eliciting vocabulary related to dryness, infertility, barrenness, beauty, the freshness of the river, and then you would move on. The teacher at this point is going to introduce them to a worksheet with the beginning of the novel on, just a few paragraphs, and the teacher would read the text or maybe use an audio for the opening paragraph for the students. And in pairs, the students would draw the scene in front of them. This is quite a good activity because then they start making explicit their understanding. Try and make it light-hearted. There's nothing like the teacher drawing worse than everybody else. It loosens everybody up, and you should label the features from the text, and that will reinforce the vocabulary. Little by little, students should be looking for the students to become aware of the careful planning of colour and line in that description. So if you look at it, you can see soft, gentle colours and gentle, straight lines. And then you take the students on, what effect would this create? And you'll be looking for them to make comments about stasis, calmness, maybe an even. Okay, the teacher can also pick up the onomatopoeia from this section and look at the rustling, the skittering, and it depends on your group. Okay, I've got the main activity showing paintings by Monk, the Automat by Edward Hopper, etc. And the students discuss the effects of these colours and lines and the strategies. And then I would then turn that understanding into the students describing their own classroom using these techniques. Now, if your students are up to that, to think hours are, then they can describe the classroom either as a peaceful or as a frightening place. And that could be set for homework, and you could maybe read one or two. If your students are not at that level, that's fine. You could give them some sentence starters, get them working in groups, give them some support of ideas that they can use, maybe even photographs yourself of the classroom. To suggest ideas. Okay, my third lesson, the last lesson now. This is quite short. I'm just giving an example of a grammar class. You'll see that in the work that Andrea's taught in the models, this will come up, something like this, where the children are using subordinate clauses. And this is an explicit grammar lesson looking at sentence types, simple, compound, and complex. So I'm starter again, writing up a short sentence, identifying the simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, introductory activity, highlighting the subordinate clause, working out how it adds more information, and then you'll have a definition, subordinate clause, what is it, how does it differ from a main clause, etc. My main activity, I probably would get them doing some interactive internet exercises. If you've got computers or iPads, fantastic. If you haven't, you could do them on the board and get the students to do them, then feedback. And then I would make a link here with Of Mice and Men, and I'd get the students to write down sentences about what they know so far of mice and men. Or the students could look at their class description and maybe add in examples of the different sentence types so that they would be beginning to redraft their work on the classroom by using different sentences. Okay, I hope that's helpful. That's just an example of 3 ways that you could teach it. Nobody would expect you to do 20 weeks of such detailed work, but it helps to know where you're going.
I would just, do you want to just go back a second, Tracy?
Yes. Yeah.
I was just going to comment a bit on your lesson planning that, I mean, I'd reinforce the fact that I think we would never really plan in this level of detail, that this is really just to offer some examples of what, of what teaching activities might look like, although I think it looks quite overwhelming on the PowerPoint slide. I think also what's really great in this example of lesson planning is, number one, trying to choose texts for the classroom that have characters which really draw in students' empathy and love for the characters, because that engagement is then going to carry them through the whole scheme of work. And then even when you're making connections to areas of grammar, for instance, and things that are perhaps less engaging, by connecting them to the literary text, you're really sustaining students' interest in the lesson. And on top of that, I think what's really notable about Tracy's planning here is going back to the different areas of objectives. We can see a real range here. You know, she's got standalone grammar, there are speaking and listening activities, there's reading, there are writing activities. So there's this constant kind of interaction of all these vital key skills. So although a literary text is at the heart of the teaching scheme, the students are constantly having all these literacy skills reinforced. Okay, so I'm going to go on now to just show you some examples of student work. I myself taught Of Mice and Men to a Year 9 class in the autumn term of this academic year, and this is some of the work they produced, just to show you some real life examples of what kind of activities we've done. So this first one is just kind of just early on in the text, trying to get to know the characters, building up some character studies You can see in this little snippet that they've listed at the top some adjectives to describe each of the characters, and then in the chart they've kind of listed some facts about the characters they've been able to deduce. And actually, some of them are quite perceptive comments, thinking about what life might be like for these characters. And as we've said, kind of developing empathy for characters in situations wholly different to their own, I think is such an incredible bonus of teaching through literature.
And if I can just come in, Andrea, this is one of the examples that I thought showed how the work with sentences can be reflected in the work on the literature. So under George, for example, you've got Lenny makes life quite difficult for George since he has to fix all of his messes and start. You can see compound sentences, complex sentences. At the bottom, you've got however. And so you can see how that's being carried through. Shall I go to the next slide?
Yeah. Okay, so you can see that I did some work here on sentence structure, just like Tracy's lesson 3, that was a standalone lesson on sentence structure. So on the left-hand side, I think we can see the student just writing down some definitions, probably from the board, on what makes the difference between a simple, a compound, a complex sentence. And actually that looks like it's mainly information they've copied down from the teacher. But then on the right hand side, we can see them experimenting a bit for themselves and trying to put that theory into practice. So and I've given them some different ways to begin complex sentences. So, you know, I especially asked them to write one sentence beginning with a gerund verb, one beginning with an adjective, one beginning with an adverb, one beginning with a connective. So then they've tried to write one in those different styles. Of course, when it comes to assessing their writing, this is building into that, because I think it's quite a high skill to be writing an extended piece of work and have real variety in the style of your sentences. And then you can see we've gone into learning about some specific types of clauses, where we've done relative clauses there. Embarrassingly, we've got a sentence about me. I'm Miss Farry, and it says, Miss Farry, who likes wearing colourful dresses, is our English teacher this year. That's true, I do like wearing colourful dresses.
You do.
Shall we go on to the next slide, Tracy? Oh, I really like this task. So again, building on our work on Of Mice and Men, but actually this task is very much focused on writing skills. It's just using the literature text as, I guess, an inspiration for the task. And as I've said in the heading there, they do need to show textual knowledge, but really that's just to make it more interesting than a typical writing task. But really they're practicing their written skills. So on the left-hand side, you can see that actually I've pretended that I'm a friend of the character George, and I've written him a letter there. So, I mean, I'm setting up the stimulus for the task there, but at the same time as the teacher, I'm modelling what an informal letter or email might look like, so that then they can notice what's the style, what, you know, how do I structure it, etc., and they can put those things into practice. And then you can see on the right hand side, the student has had to write a response to the initial letter. So I think that's a really interesting task to get students kind of thinking more imaginatively about characters, putting themselves in their shoes, but then also practicing important literacy skills.
Okay.
Okay, so this work is a lot more closely connected to working with a literary text. So we would teach students, in order to analyse what they're reading, to use a structure called PEE, which is point, evidence, explanation. So when they're writing an answer to a question, they make their point, they select some textual evidence, and then they explain that. You can see on the left-hand side, so again, this looks like some advice the students copied from the board that I've written up. So you've got some tips, you've got literally how to do it, and then you've got some kind of sentence structures that might help them to do good quality analysis, so they're not always repeating the same kind of phrases. And then you've got the student's paragraph on the right-hand side. Tracy, do you want to add anything?
No, but well, you can just see, I like the way that you use the supporting sentences. I think that often we don't realise that students do not have the same facility that we have as adults for expressing abstract ideas, and I think these supporting sentences are really useful for them. And I think that generally we need to teach much more explicitly all this language in writing, reading, speaking as well, and even in group work we need to help them.
I think you're right, because although students might be able to express themselves, they don't necessarily automatically do it in a varied and sophisticated way. So I think the more we can model to them structures for mature and fluent expression, like you say, whether it be for speaking, for writing, for analytical work like this, I think it's a great benefit.
And I think the analytical work, it leads into the formal writing as well, because it's a similar tone.
Shall we go to the next slide, Tracy?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, so I mean, this is a task that is really just getting students to engage with context. So there's a character in this novel who is black and is quite frequently discriminated against in quite a shocking way for his race. And so I really wanted students to have a good background on race in 1930s America, on the history of race in America. And actually students were very engaged with this, particularly because of contemporary culture and issues of race. You know, they all wanted to talk about things like Black Lives Matters and George Floyd and things we're seeing in the news nowadays. And actually, I think they really enjoyed putting current culture into its context, like going back to slavery and civil war and having an understanding of where all that comes from. So you can see I gave them some questions on the left-hand side. I actually set this as homework for them to prepare, for them to research these questions and to make notes. And then we had oral feedback in class the following lesson. And actually saying that, I think note-taking and knowing how to research effectively are really important skills. So I think there's a lot here that is really, really useful. And of course, a lot of crossover with other subjects here, such as history.
Yeah, and there's the constant emphasis on overlapping of reading, speaking, listening, writing, isn't there, and vocabulary all the time. Okay. All right, well, I'd like to say thank you for listening to us. We hope that it was helpful. And Andrea, last words from you?
Okay, well, we've enjoyed putting this together and thinking for ourselves about what is our best practice and hoping that we can share that with you. And we hope that it's given some of you some interesting ideas for moving forward with your English teaching.
Thank you.